The morning air felt crisp as Senator William Hayes stepped out of his home in Georgetown. The sky was clear blue, promising a beautiful September day in Washington, D.C. He straightened his red tie, a habit he'd developed over his 30 years, in politics. At 62, Hayes still carried himself with the confidence that had won him 6 straight elections. His silver hair and warm smile had become fixtures on Sunday morning talk shows and campaign posters across his home state. "Beautiful day, isn't it, Senator?" called his driver, Robert, holding the door of the black SUV open. "Couldn't ask for better," Hayes replied, sliding into the back seat. "Is the speech ready?" "On the seat beside you, sir. Your team sent the final version an hour ago." Hayes picked up the folder and flipped through his remarks for the National Policy Conference. This speech mattered more than most. Political insiders considered it the unofficial launch of his presidential campaign, though Hayes hadn't formally announced his intentions yet. The polls looked promising. Americans trusted him. They called him Honest Hayes, a nickname he'd earned through decades of fighting against government waste and corruption. As the SUV moved through the morning traffic, Hayes made a few last-minute notes in the margins of his speech. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife, Eleanor. "Knock 'em dead today. Love you." He smiled and typed back a quick reply. After 32 years of marriage, her support still meant everything. The conference center came into view, its glass facade reflecting the morning sunlight. News vans lined the street and reporters stood ready with their cameras. Hayes tucked the speech into his briefcase and straightened his tie one more time. "We're here, Senator," Robert said, pulling up to the curb. "Thanks, Robert. I should be done by 3. The moment the SUV stopped, Hayes noticed something odd. 3 unmarked black cars had pulled up behind them, and men in dark suits were getting out. He'd been in politics long enough to recognize federal agents when he saw them. "Robert, what's going on?" he asked, but his driver looked just as confused. The door opened, but it wasn't the usual security staff greeting him. Instead, a woman with short brown hair held up a badge. "Senator William Hayes, I'm Special Agent Lisa Thornton with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have a warrant for your arrest." Hayes blinked, certain he'd misheard. "Excuse me? Please step out of the vehicle, sir." The words didn't make sense. Arrests happened to criminals, to corrupt officials, to people who broke the law, not to William Hayes, not to the man whose office walls were covered with ethics awards. There must be some mistake, he said, but he found himself stepping onto the sidewalk anyway. The morning crowd outside the conference center had noticed something was happening. Phones were raised, recording. A news camera swiveled in their direction. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back, please," Agent Thornton said, her voice calm but firm. "I demand to know what this is about," Hayes said, his voice rising. His heart hammered against his ribs. "You're being arrested on charges of money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy against the United States. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The words washed over him as cold metal handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The sensation was so foreign, so impossible, that Hayes felt like he was watching it happen to someone else. People were gathering now. Whispers spread through the crowd, cameras flashed. Hayes saw faces he recognized, fellow politicians, journalists, who had interviewed him dozens of times, supporters who had voted for him for years. Their expressions ranged from shock to confusion to the beginning hints of judgment. "Senator, this way," Agent Thornton said, guiding him toward one of the unmarked cars. A reporter broke through the stunned silence. "Senator Hayes, are you being arrested?" The question snapped something inside him. "This is a mistake," he called out. "I've done nothing wrong. This is—" "Sir, I advise you not to make any statements at this time." Agent Thornton cut in. More questions flew at him from the growing crowd. "What are the charges?" "Senator, did you know this was coming? Is this related to the Thompson investigation?" Hayes had no answers. His mind raced through possibilities, searching for what could have led to this moment. Had someone framed him? Was this political payback from his enemies? A terrible misunderstanding? As they reached the car, Hayes caught his reflection in the window. His face pale, his expression stunned, his hands cuffed behind his back. It was an image that contradicted everything he knew about himself, everything the public knew about William Hayes. The car door opened and Agent Thornton helped him inside. 2 other agents got in, one on either side of him. The door closed with a thud that seemed to seal his fate. Through the tinted windows, Hayes could see the chaos unfolding outside. News crews that had come to film his speech were now capturing a very different story. People were running toward the scene from blocks away. Phones were out everywhere, recording the moment that would soon go viral across the country. "Where are you taking me?" Hayes asked as the car pulled away from the curb. "To the FBI field office, sir. Your attorney can meet us there." "My attorney handles campaign finance regulations and government ethics. He's not a criminal defense lawyer." The words criminal defense felt strange coming from his mouth. "You'll be allowed to contact whoever you need," the agent beside him said. Hayes stared out the window as Washington scrolled by, the same buildings and monuments he'd passed thousands of times before. But the city looked different now. Or perhaps he was seeing it through different eyes, the eyes of someone being taken away in handcuffs, someone whose life had just shattered in full public view. His phone was buzzing constantly in the briefcase they'd let him bring. No doubt Eleanor had seen the news already. What would he tell her? What would he tell their children, their friends, his staff, the millions of Americans who had trusted him? At a red light, Hayes noticed a street vendor selling newspapers. The headline was about healthcare legislation he'd helped pass last month. By tomorrow, his face would be on that front page for very different reasons. Back at the conference center, his speech sat undelivered in his briefcase. "Building a More Transparent America" was its title. The irony wasn't lost on him. The FBI field office appeared ahead, a nondescript building that Hayes had passed many times without much thought. Now it loomed like a fortress as they pulled into the secure garage away from the cameras and crowds. The reality of his situation began to sink in. Whatever mistake had led to this moment wouldn't be cleared up with a simple phone call. The machinery of the federal justice system was now in motion, and William Hayes, senator, potential presidential candidate, honest Hayes, was caught in its gears. The garage door closed behind them, shutting out the world that was at that very moment exploding with the news. In offices, homes, and coffee shops across America, people were seeing the footage of his arrest. News anchors were interrupting regular programming. Social media was lighting up with hashtags and theories. For 30 years, William Hayes had carefully built his reputation, his career, and his life. In 30 seconds, everything had changed. Agent Thornton opened the car door. "This way, Senator." Hayes stepped out, still handcuffed, still bewildered. The underground garage was cold and echoed with their footsteps as they walked toward the elevator. "Someone needs to call my wife," he said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "You'll be able to make calls soon," Agent Thornton assured him. As they stepped into the elevator, Hayes caught a final glimpse of himself in the polished metal doors, a man he barely recognized, being taken up to face charges he couldn't comprehend. The doors closed and William Hayes disappeared from public view. But above ground, the storm was just beginning. The arrest that would shock America was now breaking news on every channel, spreading through every social network, and rewiring the political landscape of the nation in ways that no one, especially not William Hayes, could have predicted when the day began. The first 24 hours after Senator Hayes' arrest passed in a blur of fluorescent lights, sterile rooms, and questions that seemed to have no end. He'd been fingerprinted like a common criminal, photographed for a mugshot that would soon be plastered across every news outlet in America, and placed in a holding cell until his lawyer arrived. Thomas Winters wasn't just Hayes' attorney. He'd been his friend for 25 years. When he walked into the interview room, his normally composed face showed genuine shock. "Will, what in God's name is happening?" Winters asked, setting his briefcase on the table with a thud. Hayes shook his head. "I was hoping you could tell me." Winters pulled out a chair. "They're saying money laundering, a lot of it, over a long time. That's impossible." "I know." Winters opened his briefcase and pulled out a legal pad. But the Department of Justice doesn't arrest sitting senators on a whim. They must think they have something solid. Before they could discuss further, 2 FBI agents entered the room. One carried a thick folder that he placed on the table. "Senator Hayes, I'm Agent Rodriguez, and this is Agent Chen. We'd like to ask you some questions about certain financial transactions." Hayes looked to Winters, who nodded slightly. "My client will cooperate fully, but I advise him not to answer any questions at this time." "That's your right," Agent Rodriguez said, opening the folder. "But you should know that we've been building this case for 3 years. We have bank records, wire transfers, offshore accounts, and testimony from 3 of your former staffers." The words hit Hayes like physical blows. Former staffers? Who? And what offshore accounts? He didn't have offshore accounts. "This is absurd," Hayes said. "I've spent my career fighting corruption." "Which made for an excellent cover," Agent Chen replied, sliding a document across the table. "This is just one example. A wire transfer of $8 million from the Anderson Group to an account in the Cayman Islands, registered to a shell company called Blue Harbor Ventures." Hayes stared at the paper. "I've never heard of either of those." Blue Harbor Ventures is owned by another shell company, which is owned by another, which eventually traces back to your brother-in-law, Richard Turner. Hayes felt the blood drain from his face. Richard, Eleanor's younger brother, the financial advisor who had helped manage their money for years, the man who had been the best man at their wedding. "Richard handles some investments for me, yes, but—" "Mr. Hayes," Agent Rodriguez interrupted, "we have documentation showing that over the past 15 years, you've helped direct government contracts worth billions to companies that then funneled over $200 million through this network of shell companies. Money that eventually made its way back to accounts benefiting you and your family. $200 million. The number was so large it seemed fictional." Hayes's yearly salary as a senator was $174,000. His family lived well, but not extravagantly. Where was all this money supposed to be? "I want to see every piece of evidence you have," Winters demanded. "You'll get the full discovery as the case proceeds," Agent Chen said. "For now, you should know that we've frozen all accounts connected to this investigation." "All accounts?" Hayes asked. "Even our personal accounts?" "Yes, sir. And the court has approved a search warrant for your home, your office in the Capitol, and your state office." Hayes thought of Eleanor. She would be alone when they came to search their house, turning over furniture, going through their clothes, treating their home like a crime scene. The humiliation burned in his throat. Outside the FBI building, the media circus had grown. News of Hayes's arrest had spread across the country within hours. On every major network, political commentators were speculating about the case, with many already assuming his guilt. The hashtag Dr. Hayes in cuffs was trending nationwide. In the White House press room, reporters shouted questions at the press secretary. "Does the president have any comment on Senator Hayes's arrest?" The White House respects the independence of the Justice Department and will not comment on an ongoing investigation. Senator Hayes was a vocal critic of the administration's policy on financial regulations. Is there any concern that this arrest could be seen as politically motivated? As I said, the White House has no comment on this matter. But while official Washington maintained its cautious stance, the public had no such restraint. Social media exploded with opinions, conspiracy theories, and instant judgment. At 7 p.m. Eastern Time, the Department of Justice held a press conference. The Attorney General himself stepped up to the podium, signaling the importance of the case. Today, the FBI arrested Senator William Hayes on charges of money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy against the United States. This arrest comes after a 3-year investigation that uncovered one of the most sophisticated corruption schemes we have ever seen. Cameras flashed as he continued. The evidence suggests that Senator Hayes abused his position to direct government, contracts to companies that then funneled money back to him through an elaborate network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The irony that Senator Hayes built his reputation on fighting corruption is not lost on this department. In a downtown hotel room, Eleanor Hayes watched the press conference with her hand pressed against her mouth. She'd been shopping when the news broke. A stranger had recognized her in the store and whispered, "Isn't that the wife of that corrupt senator they just arrested?" She'd fled to the hotel when she saw reporters gathering outside their home. Now, alone in this anonymous room, she watched, as her husband's reputation was shredded on national television. Her phone rang. Richard's name appeared on the screen. Her brother had been calling nonstop since the arrest. Eleanor let it go to voicemail. Something about the allegations involving offshore accounts linked to Richard had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. A terrible thought was forming. What if William was guilty? What if her brother was involved? What if their entire life had been built on a lie? Back at the FBI field office, Hayes was being processed for transfer to the Metropolitan Detention Center. His lawyer had tried to secure his release on bail, but the judge had denied the request, citing the serious nature of the charges and the potential flight risk given the offshore connections. "This is a nightmare," Hayes said as he changed into the orange jumpsuit they'd provided. "I need to talk to Eleanor." "She's not answering her phone," Winters said, "but I've sent my associate to find her. Will, I have to ask, is there any truth to any of this? Anything at all that could explain what they think they've found?" Hayes looked his old friend in the eye. "Nothing. I've never taken a dishonest dollar in my life. You know that." Winters nodded, but Hayes caught the flicker of doubt. Even his closest friends weren't sure anymore. That night, as Hayes lay on the thin mattress in his cell, he tried to make sense of what was happening. Richard. It had to be something Richard had done. But why would his brother-in-law implicate him in a money laundering scheme? And who were these former staffers who had allegedly provided testimony? Sleep evaded him as faces flashed through his mind. Peter Johnson, his chief of staff for 12 years until his retirement last spring. Diane Thompson, his legislative director who had left suddenly 6 months ago, citing family reasons. Anthony Barnes, his former campaign manager who had gone to work for a lobbying firm after Hayes's last election. Had one of them betrayed him, or all three? But betrayed him with what? There was nothing to betray. As dawn broke, Hayes was led from his cell for transport to the courthouse for his arraignment. In the harsh morning light, cameras captured his haggard face and the dark circles under his eyes. The image would be on newspaper front pages across the country. The fallen senator, hollow-eyed and broken. Inside the courtroom, Hayes pleaded not guilty to all charges. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria Patel, laid out the basics of the government's case. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Senator Hayes orchestrated a criminal enterprise that stole hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars. He used his position of public trust to enrich himself while presenting an image of incorruptibility to his constituents and the American people." As she spoke, Hayes scanned the courtroom. Eleanor wasn't there. Neither was Richard. The only familiar face was Winters, who sat beside him with a growing look of concern as the prosecutor detailed the charges. When the judge set the trial date for 8 months in the future, Hayes felt a wave of despair. 8 months in detention. 8 months of his life on hold while his reputation was destroyed. 8 months for people to assume his guilt before he ever got the chance to prove his innocence. As he was led from the courtroom, a reporter called, "Out, Senator. How does it feel to be exposed as a fraud?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but echoing in Hayes's mind as the door closed behind him. How had his life come to this? Who had set him up? And most importantly, would the truth ever come out, or was this the beginning of the end for William Hayes? 3 weeks after Senator Hayes's arrest, the ripples had turned into waves crashing against every corner of American society. What had begun as the downfall of one man was rapidly expanding into something much larger, touching lives far beyond Washington's political circles. Eleanor Hayes sat across from her lawyer in a small conference room downtown. Rain tapped against the windows, matching her mood. She'd lost weight since the arrest. Her clothes hung loose on her frame, and dark circles had taken up permanent residence under her eyes. "The prosecutors want to question me again," she said, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've told them everything I know, which is nothing. I had no idea about any of this." Her lawyer, Patricia Reynolds, nodded sympathetically. "They're hoping you'll remember something new. Some conversation, some strange meeting. Anything that might support their case against your husband. Against William and my brother, Eleanor, corrected. The dual betrayal still felt like a physical wound. Richard had disappeared the day after the arrest, only to be detained at the Canadian border 3 days later. He was now in custody, refusing to speak to Eleanor or anyone else except his lawyer. Have you decided about the house? Patricia asked gently. Eleanor stared out at the rain. Their Georgetown home, where they'd raised 3 children, hosted countless dinner parties and built a life together, was now part of the government's asset freeze. She was only allowed to live there because the prosecutors had granted special permission. I can't stay there anymore. Reporters hide in the bushes. Strangers drive by and take pictures. Someone spray-painted thief on our front steps. Her voice broke. 32 years of marriage and I never suspected a thing. What does that say about me? Patricia reached across the table and squeezed her hand. It says you trusted your husband. There's no shame in that. But there was shame. Eleanor felt it every time she went out in public. Every time she saw her name in the news, every time another friend stopped returning her calls. The wife of the corrupt senator, the sister of his accomplice, the woman who didn't know, or perhaps didn't want to know, where the money came from. Across town in a conference room at the Department of Justice, a team of 20 prosecutors and FBI agents were mapping out the expanding investigation on a massive whiteboard. Photos and names, connected by red string, formed a web that took up an entire wall. We've identified 16 companies that received government contracts through committees Senator Hayes served on, Agent Rodriguez explained to the group. Each of these companies then made payments to various shell corporations that we've linked, back to the network controlled by Richard Turner. What about the other government officials? Asked Victoria Patel, the lead prosecutor. Agent Chen pointed to another section of the board. We've confirmed that at least 3 other members of Congress were involved, as well as 5 high-ranking officials at various agencies. Arrest warrants are being prepared. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This was no longer just about one corrupt senator. It was potentially the largest government corruption scandal in modern American history. What about the defense contractors? Someone asked. 3 major companies so far. Agent Rodriguez replied. United Defense Systems, Next Gen Technologies, and Meridian Aerospace. We've served search warrants at all their headquarters this morning. As the meeting continued, news of the expanded investigation was already leaking to the press. On Wall Street, shares of the named companies plummeted. United Defense Systems lost 40% of its value in a single day, wiping out billions in market capitalization and sending shockwaves through the economy. In suburban Virginia, Thomas Powell, a mid-level engineer at United Defense, stared at his computer in disbelief as he watched his retirement savings evaporate. After 20 years with the company, a significant portion of his 401k was in company stock. This can't be happening, he muttered, as the stock price fell lower by the minute. His phone buzzed with a company-wide email. All non-essential personnel were being placed on immediate unpaid leave while the investigation proceeded. Thomas thought of his mortgage, his 2 kids in college, the braces his youngest needed. All now in jeopardy because some senator and some executives had decided to break the law. He wasn't alone. Across the country, thousands of employees at the implicated companies faced similar uncertainties. The human cost of the scandal continued to mount as the days passed. In Senator Hayes' home state, local officials who had close ties to him were facing recall efforts. The lieutenant governor, who had once been Hayes' chief of staff, resigned amid growing pressure. At the state university that had received millions in federal funding through Hayes' efforts, construction on the new research center halted abruptly when the money was frozen. 300 construction workers were laid off, and 50 research positions that had been created remained unfilled. Back in Washington, congressional hearings were hastily organized. The political theater was in full swing as lawmakers from both parties rushed to distance themselves from Hayes, while simultaneously using the scandal to attack their opponents. Senator, when was the last time you communicated with William Hayes? A committee chairman asked one witness. I haven't spoken to him in years, the nervous senator replied. though phone records would later show they had talked just 2 weeks before the arrest. In the Metropolitan Detention Center, Hayes watched the hearings on the small TV in the common area. His fellow inmates, initially impressed to have a senator among them, had grown bored with his presence. He was just another man in an orange jumpsuit now, watching his former colleagues pretend they barely knew him. His children hadn't visited yet. His oldest son had issued a public statement expressing shock and requesting privacy. His daughter, a professor at Berkeley, had gone further, denouncing him in an interview and stating that if the allegations were true, he deserved the maximum sentence. Only his youngest son had remained silent, neither condemning nor supporting him. Hayes's legal team was in shambles. Thomas Winters had withdrawn from the case, citing a conflict of interest that Hayes suspected was really fear for his own reputation. His new attorney, a young public defender named Kevin Wright, seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. "They've added 15 new charges," Wright told Hayes during a visit. "The evidence they're presenting to the grand jury keeps growing as more people cooperate." "Who's cooperating?" Hayes asked, dreading the answer. "Your former chief of staff, Peter Johnson, for one. And it looks like your brother-in-law might be negotiating a deal." Hayes felt sick. Richard was going to throw him under the bus to save himself. But what could Richard possibly say? There was no actual conspiracy to reveal. "I need you to understand something," Hayes said, leaning forward. "I didn't do this. I don't know what Richard did or what he used my name for, but I was not part of any money laundering scheme." Wright's expression remained neutral, the face of someone who had heard similar protestations from many clients. "The prosecution claims they have emails from your official account discussing the contracts and the payments. That's impossible. They also have witnesses who say they delivered cash to you personally. They're lying." Wright sighed. "Mr. Hayes, the evidence is substantial. We need to consider all options, including a potential plea deal." "I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do," Hayes insisted, his voice rising enough that a guard glanced their way. As his lawyer gathered his papers to leave, Hayes felt a wave of despair wash over him. The truth seemed to matter less and less as the case grew. The narrative had been established. William Hayes, the corrupt senator who had fooled America for decades. No one was interested in an alternative explanation. That evening, as he lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, Hayes tried to piece together what might have happened. Had Richard somehow used his position as Hayes's financial advisor to set up these offshore accounts? Had he forged emails, bribed staffers to lie? It seemed far-fetched, but what other explanation could there be? His thoughts were interrupted by a guard. "Hayes, you have a visitor." Confused, it wasn't regular visiting hours. Hayes followed the guard to the visiting area. Sitting behind the glass partition was a face he didn't expect to see. Diane Thompson, his former legislative director who had left his office 6 months before the arrest. He picked up the phone. "Diane? Senator," she said, her voice tight. "I don't have much time. They don't know I'm here." "Who doesn't know?" She glanced nervously over her shoulder. "The FBI, the prosecutors. I'm one of their witnesses." Hayes felt a surge of anger. "You're testifying against me? Diane, you know I didn't—" "Listen to me," she cut him off. "I told them what they wanted to hear because they threatened to charge me too. But something's not right. The emails they showed me, the ones they say prove you were involved, they don't sound like you. The language, the phrasing, it's not how you write." Hayes gripped the phone tighter. "Because I didn't write them." Diane nodded. "I think someone else had access to your accounts, and I think I know who." Before she could say more, a look of alarm crossed her face. "I have to go. They're watching me. Just don't give up." She hung up and hurried out, leaving Hayes staring at the empty chair. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Someone else believed in his innocence. Someone else saw what he had been trying to explain. As he was led back to his cell, Hayes made a decision. He would fight no matter how much evidence they claimed to have against him. He would find the truth, even from behind bars. Because if Diane was right, then this wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about exposing whoever had orchestrated the biggest political frame-up in American history. 5 months had passed since Senator William Hayes's arrest, and America had changed. The scandal had grown into a sprawling investigation, touching nearly every corner of government. 27 people had been arrested so far, including 3 other members of Congress, 2 federal judges, and executives from 7 major corporations. The public's trust in government had plummeted to historic lows. Hayes had lost weight in detention. His once silver hair had dulled to a flat gray, and deep lines had etched themselves around his eyes and mouth. But today, for the first time, since his arrest, there was energy in his step as he was led into the small conference room where his new legal team waited. After Kevin Wright had pushed for a plea deal one too many times, Hayes had fired him. Now he was represented by Marissa Chen, a defense attorney known for taking on impossible cases and winning them. "Senator," she said, rising to greet him. Unlike others, she still used his title. "We have developments." Hayes took a seat at the table where 3 other lawyers from Chen's team were arranging documents. "Tell me." Chen nodded to a young attorney who opened a laptop. "This is Alan Park, our digital forensics specialist. He's found something you need to see." Park turned the screen toward Hayes. "We've been analyzing the emails the prosecution claims you sent discussing the offshore accounts. Using linguistic analysis software, we compared them to thousands of your verified emails, speeches, and writings." On the screen, Hayes saw columns of data and complicated graphs. "In simple terms," Park continued, "these emails weren't written by you. The sentence structure, word choice, even the time of day they were sent, none of it matches your patterns. Whoever wrote these was trying to sound like you, but they made consistent mistakes." For the first time in months, Hayes felt a flicker of hope. "Can this prove my innocence?" "It's strong evidence," Chen said cautiously, "but not definitive. We need more. That's where our second development comes in." She slid a folder across the table. "Diane Thompson came to us with these." Hayes opened the folder to find printed copies of emails and financial records. "What am I looking at?" "Evidence that your brother-in-law, Richard Turner, had been planning this for years. Diane was suspicious of him for months before she left your office. She started keeping records, making copies of strange correspondence, noting unusual meetings." Hayes leafed through the documents, his heart racing. "Why didn't she come forward sooner?" "Fear," Chen said simply. "The FBI threatened her with charges of her own. But after she visited you, she couldn't stay silent. She's agreed to testify for us, at great personal risk." Hayes stared at a particular email that showed Richard had been meeting secretly with Peter Johnson, Hayes's former chief of staff who was now testifying for the prosecution. "They were working together against me, but why?" Chen's expression darkened. "Money, primarily. But there's more to it. Richard resented living in your shadow, being the senator's brother-in-law, the one who handled your modest investments while you became a national figure. And Peter? Gambling debts, lots of them. Richard paid them off in exchange for Peter's help in setting you up." Hayes shook his head in disbelief. The betrayal cut deep. Peter had been with him for 12 years, had stood beside him through campaigns, policy fights, family celebrations. "We're filing a motion tomorrow to dismiss all charges," Chen continued. "I don't expect it to succeed. The prosecution will fight tooth and nail, but it puts our evidence on the record and signals that we're going on the offensive." For the first time since his arrest, Hayes allowed himself to think beyond the walls of the detention center. "What about the public? Everyone believes I'm guilty." "That's our other front," Chen said, gesturing to another member of her team. "This is Olivia Winters, our media strategist." Olivia opened her own folder. "We've prepared a 3-phase approach to reshaping the narrative. First, we released the forensic analysis of the emails to select journalists who've shown some skepticism about the case. Second, we arranged for Diane to give an exclusive interview about what she discovered and why she came forward. Third, we launch a website with all the exculpatory evidence, presented in a way that's accessible to the public." Hayes nodded slowly. "And Eleanor? My children?" Chen's expression softened. "Your wife filed for divorce, as you know. That's proceeding. But she's agreed to make a statement that while your marriage is over, she has questions about your guilt given this new evidence. It wasn't much, but it was something. Hayes had accepted that his marriage couldn't survive this ordeal. Too much damage had been done, too much trust broken, even if he was eventually cleared. And my kids? Your oldest son and daughter are still processing. Your youngest has agreed to visit next week. Hayes rubbed his eyes, which had suddenly grown moist. One small victory. Outside the Metropolitan Detention Center, America continued to grapple with the fallout from the scandal. Congressional approval ratings had dropped to single digits. A wave of anti-corruption protests had swept through major cities. Reform candidates were announcing campaigns for the next election, many of them political newcomers promising to clean up Washington. In a studio at the National News Network, popular anchor David Wilson prepared for a primetime special, On the Case. His producer stood nearby reviewing the final script. "You sure about this angle?" the producer asked nervously. "The network has been pushing the Hayes is guilty narrative for months." Wilson straightened his tie. "I go where the facts lead, and these new forensic analyses raise serious questions. The executives won't like it. Then they can fire me." Wilson had built his reputation on integrity. He wasn't about to compromise it now, even if questioning Hayes' guilt had become deeply unpopular. The special aired that night to an audience of millions. Wilson methodically laid out the new evidence, interviewed linguistic experts who confirmed the findings about the emails and raised uncomfortable questions about the prosecution's case. "We must consider the possibility," he said in his closing remarks, "that in our rush to judgment, in our hunger for a satisfying narrative about a corrupt politician getting his comeuppance, we may have missed something crucial. The truth." The response was immediate and divided. Some viewers praised Wilson for his courage, while others accused him of trying to rehabilitate a clearly guilty man. The hashtag, Hayes Innocent, began trending, battling for dominance with Diabros Wilson sellout. In her apartment, Diane Thompson watched the special with growing anxiety. Going public with what she knew had put her in danger. She'd already received threatening phone calls. Twice, she'd spotted the same car parked outside her building for hours. Her lawyer had advised her to leave town until the trial, but she had refused. Running would make her look guilty, unreliable. The knock at her door made her jump. She approached cautiously, checking the peephole. A delivery person stood outside with a package. Relieved, she opened the door. "Delivery for Diane Thompson?" "That's me." As she signed for the package, she didn't notice the man watching from a car across the street, taking photos. She wouldn't know until much later that the prosecution had just added her to their witness list, not as a witness against Hayes, but as a co-conspirator. At the Department of Justice, the mood was tense. Victoria Patel paced the conference room where her team had gathered. "Chen's team is good," she admitted. "The linguistic analysis is compelling, and this witness, Diane Thompson, could sway a jury if she's credible." "So what's our strategy?" an assistant prosecutor asked. Patel stopped pacing. "We discredit Thompson, paint her as a disgruntled employee who's making up stories to get back at Hayes for some perceived slight. And we keep pushing the financial evidence. The money trail doesn't lie." "And if Hayes is actually innocent?" someone asked quietly. The room fell silent. No one had dared voice that possibility before. Patel's expression hardened. "We've invested too much in this case. The department's reputation is on the line. The Attorney General himself has vouched for our evidence. We move forward." Back in his cell that night, Hayes allowed himself to feel something he'd almost forgotten: hope. His legal team had a strategy. New evidence was emerging. For the first time, there was a path, narrow and treacherous but real, that led away from a life in prison and toward vindication. He thought of Diane, risking everything to come forward. Of David Wilson, putting his career on the line, to question the prevailing narrative. Of Marissa Chen, who had taken his case when no one else would. As he drifted off to sleep, Hayes realized the fight ahead would be even harder than the one behind him. The prosecution wouldn't back down easily. Too many powerful people were implicated. Too many reputations were at stake. And Richard, his brother-in-law, the architect of his downfall, was still out there, still spinning his web of lies. But for tonight at least, William Hayes slept better than he had in months. Tomorrow would bring a new battle, but for the first time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. stood tall against the clear blue, September sky, almost exactly 8 months after Senator William Hayes had been arrested. The building was surrounded by crowds, protesters with signs, reporters with cameras, curious onlookers drawn by the spectacle of the trial that had captivated the nation. Inside, the main courtroom was packed to capacity. Every seat was filled with people standing along the walls. The trial had been underway for 6 weeks, each day bringing new revelations, shocking testimony, and dramatic confrontations between the prosecution and defense. Hayes sat at the defense table beside Marissa Chen. He wore a navy suit that hung loose on his frame. He'd lost 30 pounds during his time in detention. His hands were steady as he reviewed his notes. Today, he would take the stand in his own defense. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Franklin Thompson entered the courtroom. The judge, a stern man with 40 years on the bench, took his seat and surveyed the packed room. "I'll remind everyone that outbursts will not be tolerated. This is a court of law, not a sporting event." He turned to Chen. "Counselor, call your next witness." Chen stood. "The defense calls Senator William Hayes." A murmur ran through the courtroom as Hayes walked to the witness stand. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then settled into the chair that would be his home for the next several hours. "Senator Hayes," Chen began, "did you orchestrate a money laundering scheme using government contracts?" "I did not," Hayes replied, his voice strong and clear. "Did you direct government contracts to companies in exchange for kickbacks?" "I did not." "Did you knowingly benefit from offshore accounts set up by your brother-in-law, Richard Turner?" "I did not," Chen nodded. "Then please explain to the court in your own words what you believe happened." Hayes took a deep breath. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, the chance to tell his side of the story. He looked out at the sea of faces watching him. Somewhere in the crowd were his children. His youngest son had been visiting regularly. His daughter had come once, still unsure what to believe. His oldest son had yet to make contact. "For 30 years, I served in Congress with one goal, to make government work better for the American people. I fought against corruption, against waste, against the misuse of taxpayer money. I wasn't perfect, no politician is, but I never, ever betrayed the public trust for personal gain." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "My brother-in-law, Richard Turner, handled financial matters for my family. I trusted him completely. He was family. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that he was using my position, my reputation, and my name to enrich himself through an elaborate fraud." Hayes detailed how, according to the evidence his team had uncovered, Richard had been working for years to build a network of shell companies. How he had cultivated relationships with Hayes's staffers, particularly Peter Johnson, his former chief of staff. How together they had created false emails, forged documents, and fabricated meetings that never happened. "The prosecution has shown you bank records of accounts I supposedly controlled. They've shown you emails I supposedly wrote. They've brought forward witnesses who claim I was aware of everything. But as our expert witnesses have testified, those emails don't match my writing style. Those meetings don't appear in my official calendar. Those bank accounts were set up with forged signatures." For 2 hours, Hayes walked through the evidence, explaining inconsistencies, pointing out contradictions in the prosecution's case, and steadfastly maintaining his innocence. When Chen finished her questions, it was Victoria Patel's turn. The lead prosecutor approached the stand with a confidence that had served her well throughout the trial. "Senator Hayes, you've painted quite a picture of an elaborate conspiracy against you. It sounds almost like a movie plot, doesn't it?" "The truth often seems unbelievable," Hayes replied. "Indeed." Patel picked up a document. "Let's talk about the vacation home in Aspen purchased by one of these shell companies, a home that you and your family used regularly. I believed that Home belonged to a campaign donor who allowed us to use it occasionally. I had no idea Richard had arranged the purchase. And the yacht in the Bahamas? Another property I believed belonged to a supporter. Patel raised an eyebrow. How convenient that you knew nothing about any of these luxury items you enjoyed. There was nothing suspicious about influential people offering their properties to a senator. It happens all the time. Perhaps. But most senators check who actually owns these properties. The questioning continued for hours. Patel hammered away at Hayes's claim of ignorance, suggesting it was implausible that he could have been unaware of such a massive scheme operating under his nose. She brought up inconsistencies in his previous statements, meetings that couldn't be explained away, and the testimony of witnesses who claimed to have delivered cash directly to him. Through it all, Hayes remained composed, though beads of sweat formed on his forehead under the hot courtroom lights. He had prepared for this cross-examination for weeks, but the reality was even more grueling than he had imagined. Finally, as the day drew to a close, Patel asked her final question. Senator Hayes, if you're innocent, why did 3 of your closest enough staffers testify that you were involved? Hayes looked directly at the jury. Because they were either complicit in my brother-in-law's scheme, or they were manipulated into believing I was involved. Peter Johnson, as the evidence shows, had gambling, debts that Richard paid off in exchange for his cooperation. The others were shown falsified emails and documents that made it appear I was part of the plan. As Hayes stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. His testimony had been compelling, but had it been enough to overcome the mountain of evidence the prosecution had presented? Outside the courthouse, the media was already analyzing every word, every gesture. On talk shows and news programs across the country, experts debated whether Hayes was a master manipulator or the victim of an unprecedented frame-up. In a coffee shop 3 blocks from the courthouse, Diane Thompson watched the coverage on her laptop. She was scheduled to testify the next day. Her chance to explain how she had uncovered Richard's scheme, the evidence she had gathered, and why she had initially been afraid to come forward. Her hands shook as she closed her laptop. The last few months had been a nightmare. She'd lost friends, been labeled a conspiracy theorist, and received death threats from people who believed she was helping a corrupt senator escape justice. But she knew what she had seen. She knew the truth. And tomorrow, she would tell it to the world. The next morning, the courtroom was even more crowded. Diane's testimony had been highly anticipated since the defense had first named her as a witness. As she took the stand, she appeared nervous but determined. For 3 hours, she methodically laid out what she had discovered while working in Hayes's office. Mysterious meetings Richard had arranged that weren't on the official schedule. Documents she had found that didn't make sense. Conversations she had overheard between Richard and Peter Johnson that had raised red flags. I didn't understand what was happening at first, she explained. But I knew something wasn't right. So I started keeping records, making copies. When I found emails in the senator's account that he couldn't have written, they were sent when he was giving speeches I attended, I realized someone had access to his accounts. The prosecution tried to paint her as disgruntled, as someone with a grudge against Hayes who had invented this conspiracy theory to explain why she had left his office. But Diane's detailed records, her clear recollection of events, and her calm demeanor under pressure made her a compelling witness. The trial entered its final days. Both sides presented their closing arguments. Victoria Patel reminded the jury of the financial evidence, the witness testimony, and the improbability of such an elaborate scheme happening without Hayes's knowledge. Marissa Chen countered by highlighting the forensic evidence proving the emails were forged, the inconsistencies in the prosecution witness's testimony, and the clear motive Richard Turner had to set up his brother-in-law. Then it was time for the jury to deliberate. For 3 days, the country waited. News channels ran constant coverage. Social media exploded with theories and predictions. Outside the courthouse, the crowds grew larger each day. On the morning of the 4th day, word came. The jury had reached a verdict. Hayes was led into the courtroom, his face a mask of composure despite the turmoil inside him. This was the moment that would define the rest of his life. Chen squeezed his arm in silent support as they took their seats. Judge Thompson addressed the packed room. "I understand the jury has reached a verdict?" The jury foreman, a retired schoolteacher, stood. "We have, Your Honor. On the count of conspiracy against the United States, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, William Hayes, not guilty." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. "On the count of money laundering, how do you find?" "Not guilty." "On the count of wire fraud, how do you find?" "Not guilty." One by one, the foreman read the verdicts for all 42 counts. Not guilty. Not guilty. Not guilty. Hayes sat motionless, the words washing over him. Not guilty. The two words he had been fighting to hear for 8 months. Not guilty. Chen was beaming beside him. In the gallery, his youngest son was openly weeping. His daughter sat stunned, her hand over her mouth. Even his oldest son, who had finally come to court for the verdict, showed emotion on his usually stoic face. As the judge dismissed the jury and concluded the proceedings, reporters raced from the courtroom to break the news. Outside, the crowd erupted when word spread. "Not guilty," people shouted. Signs that had condemned Hayes were dropped to the ground. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing the scene for the millions watching at home. Hayes emerged from the courthouse into the bright sunlight, flanked by his legal team and his children. For the first time in 8 months, he was a free man. Cameras and microphones were thrust toward him. "Senator Hayes, how do you feel? What will you do now? Will you sue the government? Will you return to politics?" Hayes raised a hand for quiet. The crowd gradually fell silent, waiting for his words. "Today, justice was served," he began, his voice steady. "But this isn't just a victory for me. It's a reminder of how precious our justice system is, and how vigilant we must be to protect it." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "I lost 8 months of my life. I lost my marriage. I lost the trust of many Americans. I can never fully recover those losses. But I can move forward, and I can continue to serve this country I love, not as a senator, but as a citizen committed to reform." Hayes's case had exposed deep flaws in the system, how evidence could be manipulated, how prosecutors could be blinded by ambition, how the court of public opinion could convict someone before they ever faced a jury. "I don't blame the American people for believing I was guilty," he continued. "The evidence seemed overwhelming. What I hope we all take from this experience is the importance of presuming innocence, of questioning narratives, and of demanding the highest standards from our justice system." As Hayes concluded his remarks and walked down the courthouse steps, people reached out to touch him, to shake his hand, to apologize for doubting him. The arrest that had shocked America had been followed by a trial that challenged America, and now an acquittal that would change America. The road ahead would not be easy. Richard Turner and Peter Johnson still faced their own trials. The full extent of their scheme was still being uncovered. Many people would still doubt Hayes's innocence despite the verdict. But for now, William Hayes was free. Free to rebuild his life, free to restore his reputation, free to remind Americans that even in the darkest moments, the truth, however unlikely, however buried, could still prevail.